Hello, everyone. Let me just see if it's working. Hello, everyone. My name is Aditya, and I am the representative for animal ethics in India. And today, on the occasion for the World Day of the End of Speciesism, we at Animal Ethics are participating in these worldwide events that are occurring. And we are participating by giving this talk on why it is important to reject speciesism and also the implications of rejecting it. For those of you who are not aware about animal ethics, we are an international anti-speciesist advocacy organization, and our focus is on creating a better world for all sentient beings. So let me start the talk for today. Yeah. So we are all aware of the different forms of discrimination that occur in the world against individuals based on arbitrary reasons like their color or their gender. And we all deem these, most of us deem these reasons as unjust. So let us look at what exactly is speciesism before we explore the different forms of speciesism and what we can do about it. We'll also be looking at a much more neglected form of speciesism, which is not talked a lot among animal advocates. And we'll also look at what animal ethics is doing to combat this form of speciesism. So to start off with, what is speciesism? As I mentioned, there are different forms of discrimination against humans based on arbitrary reasons. And most of us deem these discrimination as unjust because the reasons which we use for justifying these discriminations is not reasonable. Similarly, speciesism is a form of discrimination against individuals based on their species membership, where we give less moral consideration to individuals based on which species they are born into. And this is very widespread and prevalent in today's society, and very few people question it. And that is the reason why we don't think twice before, when I say we, the society in general thinks twice about exploiting them for food, clothing, entertainment, vice versa. And so this is what's happening in general across the world. And let us look at different forms of speciesism that exist in the society today. And one of the most widely held forms of speciesism is called as anthropocentrism. This is the view where the interests of humans are regarded much higher priority than equally strong interests of other animals. The defenders of this view usually claim that humans have certain capacities which justify treating humans in a much, giving the preferences of human much higher weight than equally stronger interests of animals. And they take different forms. So when we consider discrimination, what comes into play is moral consideration. And what is moral consideration? It means taking into consideration how the individuals are affected by the actions, attitudes, or omissions that we do. So the defenders of the view anthropocentrism claim that only humans should be morally considered and the animals can be rejected. And it's not just species, and it's not just a form where only humans are regarded priority and the non-human animals are discriminated. There's also forms of speciesism where there is discrimination among two different species of non-human animals. And these take different forms. The first form is discrimination against animals based on aesthetic preferences. For example, a panda, which is considered cute, might be given higher preference and might be considered morally, whereas an animal which we don't consider aesthetically pleasing, for example, a rat or a pig, might be disregarded from our moral circle. Similarly, based on our scientific interest. So scientists usually consider the animals that are valuable for conservationist reasons, which are either endangered or play a very crucial role in the functioning of a given ecosystem. So these animals are usually considered by humans and they are given more preference and they're protected, whereas animals which are not scientifically interesting are disregarded. For example, the invasive species, which are considered a threat to a given ecosystem, they are usually killed in very harmful ways. Another less known form of speciesism is where we are psychologically disposed to care about the larger animals like the elephants, the tigers, and the deers, which are more relatable to us based on their size, and we disregard the animals which are much more numerous in the wild, like the rats or the invertebrates, which are much higher in number. And we rarely look into the interests of these small creatures as opposed to the larger ones. Now let us look at some of the arguments that the defenders of speciesism or anthropocentrism use to defend it, which is that only humans should be respected. The first argument that they use is that since humans have this complex intellectual capacity and we have more sophisticated cognitive capacities, only humans should be considered, that the intelligence or the intellectual capacity should be like the criteria based on which we extend moral consideration to individuals. The next one is that we share a special relationship of solidarity or sympathy with certain humans, that we share certain bonds with humans, we share a society, they are part of our social circle, hence that justifies only considering humans into our moral consideration. And because we don't share a special relationship with animals, it's fine to disregard them. And the third, which is the argument from might, which is of that humans are more powerful than other animals, that we share a power relationship with them, where we have the capacity to exploit them, and we are more powerful than them. Hence, that justifies disregarding the interests of animals, which are considered to be more inferior, and hence they can be disregarded from the moral circle. So these are three of the most common reasons which are used by the defenders of speciesism to justify discriminating against non-human animals based on these reasons. But let us look at why these reasons are unjustified and they don't hold up under scrutiny. So one of the common misconceptions that most defenders of speciesism have is that there is this line that divides the non-human animals from the humans, which is that we possess something very unique about ourselves, like intellectual capacities, which separate us from the rest of the non-human animals. But that is not actually the case. In fact, there are many groups of humans who do not possess the complex intellectual capacities. For example, children, or for example, the cognitively disabled humans who do not have the intellectual capacities that most of us do. But we do not use that as a reason to justify disregarding their interests. For example, recently in a study, it was shown that a pig has similar IQ to that of a 3-year-old child. But we wouldn't justify treating a child in a way we treat a pig and the way we exploit pigs in the industry. In fact, we give these sections of humans honorary consideration, and we treat them in ways where their special needs are considered. So this is what we extend towards them. We do not use the justification that they are intellectually less sophisticated, hence we can discriminate against them. And also the second reason which the defenders of speciesism use is that because we share a special relationship with certain people, only they should be considered. But there are many groups of humans we don't share special relationship with, like, for example, people from different countries, or it's the same justification that racists use, that just we share a special relationship with certain races, so hence we should only consider them and we should disregard the races which are more distant from us. So this is not justified. We don't accept this reasoning. Similarly, the third reason which we use is that of power relation, which is where we find it okay to discriminate against people who are less powerful than us. But we do not use that justification to disregard the interests of a baby or of people who are enslaved. In fact, we widely condemn such forms of relationship where the one who is more powerful oppresses the one who is less powerful. So with humans, we do reject all the three reasons which are used to justify discriminating against animals. So this is called as the argument from species overlap, where we reject all these reasons. So because there are many sections of humans who also fall under this category where they are less, they do not possess these capacities, these intellectual capacities or these special relationships, and we still give them honorary consideration. Then it also extends that we give equal consideration to non-human animals, and we also give them full moral consideration. So what is baseline relevant when we are deciding on which beings to give moral consideration to is whether they are affected by our actions, whether they consciously experience our actions, which is where sentience comes into the picture. Sentience is the only relevant property for deserving moral consideration. Some people also choose to give moral consideration to non-sentient objects. But when we look at what is actually relevant is if the being can consciously being harmed or benefited. So sentience is the capacity to have both positive and negative experiences, to experience pain and suffering, as well as to experience pleasure and other positive experiences. And there is enough evidence that a lot of animals are sentient. In fact, there was this conference called Cambridge Declaration of Consciousness, this agreement by the most prominent cognitive neuroscientists and other scientists who came together, and they declared that humans are not unique in possessing sentience and consciousness. In fact, all mammals and birds and many invertebrates possess the capacity and neurological structures necessary to give rise to sentience. And they mainly look at two major criteria to decide if animals are sentient or not. The first one is their behavioral features, if they react to negative stimuli and are attracted to positive stimuli. And the second one they look at is the physiological structures necessary to give rise to sentience. So let us look at some examples. For example, even birds have the physiological structures necessary to give rise to sentience, which is they have a central nervous system and they have a centralization of the structure in the brain. So that is what is crucial when the scientists look at if a being has a particular structure, which is a centralization of information processing, which occurs in the brain for most mammals and birds. But that's not all. There are certain species like crustaceans have homologous structures like ganglia, which function similar to central nervous system. And there's also centralization of ganglia, which acts functionally similar to central nervous system. And they also exhibit the behavior which shows that they are repelled by negative stimuli and are attracted to positive stimuli. In fact, lobsters show much complex behavior when they come in contact with predators. For example, they hide in their shells for long, or they leave their shells, and they also possess long-term memory, and they come back to their shells after many months, and they're able to identify which shell is theirs. And it's not just the larger mammals and larger animals. There's also smaller animals and invertebrates which show complex behavior, like honeybees have the waggle, very famous waggle dance, where they communicate with the rest of their hive the distance of a flower patch by rotating in a certain direction particular number of times, where they communicate with the rest of the hive that the food source is in that direction and so many miles away. This has also been observed by scientists, and they are able to observe based on the behavior of these honeybees if they are communicating the distance of the food source. So they do possess the complex behavior, and they also have the physiological structures, which is they have ganglia, and they also have a brain, which is a centralization of the nerve and ganglia, which allows them to process the information and process pain as well as suffering. So these are some indicators which we look at when we are deciding if biological animals are capable of being sentient or not, which is they show the behavior to exhibit sentience, and they also have the physiological structures necessary. A lot of living animals are not sentient. For example, plants and sponge, which respire and which reproduce, but they do not have any physiological structures necessary to have sentience, as well as they don't show any form of behavior, active behavior, that they are trying to escape from pain or suffering. And it's not just biological mammals that might have the capacity to be sentient. Maybe in the future, there might be artificial beings which possess the structure as well as the behavior, which indicates that they are experiencing things consciously. So this was a little brief about sentience to show that a lot of animals are sentient and they experience pain and suffering and pleasure. Now let us look at why this was important and how humans are terribly exploiting non-human animals and how we use them and our attitudes towards the non-human animals. It's estimated that more than 80 billion mammals and birds are annually exploited and killed by humans. And if we talk about fishes, they are one of the most numerous individuals that are exploited by humans, with an estimate of close to 2 trillion fishes that are killed. And if we include the other aquatic animals, the number is much higher. And if we also consider the reason we exploit invertebrates, for example, for honey or silk or for color substances like cochnia, the number explodes to much higher number, and several trillion invertebrates are killed every year. Let us look at some instances and ways in which humans exploit animals and how much suffering we cause them. Aquatic animals are one of the most widely exploited species by humans. They are killed in very, very painful ways. And the fishing industry is increasing significantly year after year. And it's estimated that close to 3 trillion fishes are killed every year. And if we include the other aquatic wild animals, then the number exceeds to like the other, like lobsters and crabs and prawns, they exceed to like 100 billion in quantity. And also, we don't have exact estimates of the number of individuals that are killed by fishes because they are usually weighed by tons. So it's very hard to estimate the number of individuals that are actually killed in this process. And they are killed in very, very stressful ways. For example, they are pulled out of the oceans and they are asphyxiated to death, or they die under the weight and they're crushed by the other fishes, or they're dismembered when they are alive, which is a very painful experience. And fishes do show the behavior and they do possess the physiological structures necessary to experience pain and suffering. So if we can only imagine the amount and the magnitude of pain and suffering that is involved in this industry and the number of individuals that are exploited by humans. And it's not just the species that humans are targeting to exploit, but also there are bycatches. And it's estimated that there are more than 1 million bycatches like sea turtles, invertebrates, dolphins, and the other aquatic wild animals which are also caught under these nets. And while some of them are let back into the ocean, they usually die due to the injuries that occur when they are being fished out. And let's look at some other ways in which we harm non-human animals. Pigs, for example, it's estimated that annually more than 300 million pigs are killed in US alone. And even China has significantly started farming pigs for human consumption. And they are farmed in very terrible ways. For example, they are put inside these structures called as gestation crates, where they are not allowed to move around. This is where they are pregnant and where they give birth to the piglets. And they spend their life like this for 16 weeks approximately. And after which they are transported to the farrowing crate, where they are allowed to nurse their children for a few weeks. And in this crate, they're not even having space to move around. They don't have the capacity to, exhibit their natural behavior. They are not allowed to form social bonds. They're not allowed to have interactions with the other animals of their species. And they usually undergo a lot of suffering. So this is their usual life, and they're also killed in very harmful ways by being put into gas chambers where they suffocate to death. And if you look at birds, they are one of the most largest exploited land bird, and it's estimated that close to 50 billion hens are farmed and killed worldwide. And these are the layer hens, where they are put into these tiny battery cages where they occupy a space of an A4 size paper, where they do not even have space to move around. They get so stressed that they start pecking the other hens they are crammed into with, and they start cannibalizing each other. And to prevent themselves from killing each other, the industry resorts to debeaking, where they cut off the beaks with hot iron so that they don't kill each other to death. And since they don't get access to sunlight or fresh environment, they usually get sick and diseased. But the farmers don't pick out the hens when they are sick, or they don't give them veterinary care, because the number of individuals in a single factory farm is very huge. So it's very difficult for a farmer to give individual attention to all these hens. So these hens are usually they usually die within the cages, and then they are not removed from the cage until the farmer removes all of them to be sent to slaughterhouse. And the poultry industry also has another another very horrible way of killing day-old male chicks, because the poultry industry profits over laying of hens, and since male chicks don't lay hens, they are usually killed to protect the cause, and they are killed in very harmful ways. For example, they are either ground up and sent to pet food industries, or they are dumped into trash and burnt. And as you can see in this picture, they are about to be drowned. And it's reasonable to expect that all the chicks that are under in the bottom of the sack, they are already being crushed by the chicks, the weight of the chicks on the top. So they do die in very harmful ways, and their welfare is given no consideration at all. And some people assume that once they stop giving up meat, they have stopped participating in animal cruelty or animal exploitation, but that's not really the case. Even if we are not consuming cows, we are still exploiting them for other reasons, which is, even for the production of dairy, there is a lot of cruelty involved and a lot of suffering involved for the individuals in that industry. For example, cows give milk only when they are pregnant, and to make them pregnant, they are artificially inseminated and they are forced to give birth. And this is a repeated cycle because it happens year after year. And once the calf is born, the calves are separated from their mother because they would be drinking the milk which will be used for human consumption. So they are separated from their mother and not allowed to drink their mother's milk. And they're also distanced from the nourishment and the maternal bond which the calves and the mother share. And they're given replacers instead of milk, which is very, very traumatic and stressful for the calves, because they cry for days on end when they're separated from their mothers. And these calves, the male calves, are generally used for the veal or the beef industry, where they are given very less food and they are neglected. And in the end, they are sent to the slaughterhouse to be killed. So these were some of the terrible ways in which we humans exploit and harm animals. And I've just given you a very tiny brief. The actual reality and the scale at which humans exploit and harm animals is very, very huge, that it is almost incomprehensible. So this is completely unjustified. As I've said, these are sentient animals which feel pain, suffering, and they experience pleasure. And the reason why we are disregarding their interests is because of this bias and because of this ideology of speciesism, where we use unjustified reasons to discriminate against these individuals, to disregard their interests, and to justify harming them. And we at Animal Ethics are rejecting speciesism, and hence we are demanding the changes that are necessary to achieve animal liberation and to liberate them from the harms that humans are causing them. The first one is to end their current legal status as property, because as long as animals are viewed as commodity or objects, they will never be considered as living sentient beings. Their interests will always be disregarded and their needs will always be neglected as long as they're treated as property or commodity. They need to be granted personhood and be treated as sentient beings with interests that need to be taken into consideration. The second thing is that the reason why speciesism is so widely held across different cultures is because since our childhood, we are taught that it's okay to harm certain species of animals. And speciesism, as I said, does not only separate humans from animals, but it also justifies discriminating one species against the other species. For example, we would value a dog, but we would not value a pig the same way. We would give moral consideration to dogs, cats, peacocks, or tigers, and not to other individuals. And it also varies based on the region. For example, in India, they give special moral consideration to cows, but they do not give this moral consideration to buffaloes, for example. And so even based on the region, the flavor of speciesism differs. So the foundation of speciesism occurs during the childhood through education, where we are taught in the academics and by our society that it's okay to discriminate against non-human animals and to disregard their interests. So we propose education as a tool to challenge speciesism by educating people about why speciesism is unjustified and why it is important to reject it and what are the implications of rejecting it. So giving talks at institutions and schools and changing the academic material to be more anti-speciesist would serve this purpose of educating society on the whole that speciesism is unjustified. And another reason why people usually are reluctant to move away from speciesist attitudes is because they consume animal products daily in their lives, whether it is for food, for clothing, for the cosmetics that they use. So all of these involve animal exploitation. So it is very important for us to find replacements or alternatives for practices where animals are used or harmed. So this involves, for example, adopting plant-based meat or cultured meat in the place of the animal-based meat, or finding replacements for animal experimentation where animals are not used. And similarly, there are a lot of alternatives for clothing where animal skin is used as clothing. We can find alternatives or synthetic alternatives for those, which allow us to move away from exploitative practices. So these are the three main demands that we put forward, which we feel are necessary to move towards a world that is more anti-speciesist and where animals are granted moral consideration. Again, rejecting speciesism does not only mean that we are against harms caused to animals by humans. It also means that we are actively in favor of helping them whenever possible. For example, if a human was suffering from a harm that was not human caused or was not anthropogenic, we would still extend help to them and we would offer assistance to them to come out of those natural harms. So if we reject speciesism, that would also mean that we extend helping animals, even if they're not harmed by anthropogenic causes, by human caused causes. We also extend help to them whenever they are undergoing harm due to other reasons. And this is very relevant for animals in the wild. The usual assumption is that animals are living a very idyllic life in the wild, and as long as humans don't interfere in the wild, that animals are living a very beautiful life. They are in harmony, they are not suffering, and they are living a life of satisfaction and well-being. But that is not truly the case. Animals in the wild as well are sentient, as I've said before, and they also undergo a lot of harms. But humans do intervene in the wild. They usually intervene in the wild out of goodwill to help the animals that are affected by natural causes. Let us look at some of the cases in which humans have helped animals. For example, this is a moose that's stuck in an ice lake during the winter, and humans, the rescuers have gone out of their way to help the moose come out of the ice lake. And similarly, during the tides or due to predators, animals usually get disoriented and they come onto the shores and they get stranded on the shores. And this is very common, for example, in certain countries like New Zealand, where whales are regularly stranded on the shores. And there are institutions and rescuers who regularly go out of their way to bring the aquatic animals back into the water bodies. So people do help these animals as well. And also, animals in the wild usually get orphaned or abandoned when, for example, when their parents abandon them when they are being chased by predators. So these animals are rescued and put into treatment centers, and they're rehabilitated and taken care of. Similarly, there's also a lot of amphibian animals that, for example, that lay eggs on the shore and they get disoriented and are affected by anthropogenic causes, like being run over by vehicles or attacked by predators. And these animals are taken into treatment centers and rescued. And there's also the assumption that wild animals only exist in the untouched territories in the forests, but there are a lot of urban wild animals as well. For example, squirrels, pigeons, bats, and all these animals could be classified under urban wild animals. So these animals also usually get injured. For example, baby squirrels fall out of trees and they have a fractured limb. And usually rescuers rescue these animals and they give them care and foster them until they are able to fend for themselves. It's not just individual animals being helped. There's also cases of large-scale interventions to help a huge number of animals. For example, there are feeding programs conducted in Turkey. This is an example in Turkey where during the harsh weather conditions, there is shortage of food. So people come, like there are institutions which conduct large scale feeding program for deer in this example. And usually these programs are conducted for conservationist reasons to protect the number of species that are existing in that area. So even though the intention is not towards the individual wild animal, these interventions still help in in helping these animals during these conditions. And similarly, diseases are widespread, and diseases like rabies, anthrax, they are very widespread in many parts of the world. So there are interventions where the vaccines for rabies are put into these cookies and dropped off from helicopters and dropped into these wild regions where the animals consume these cookies and they are vaccinated against the diseases. And again, the reason they are vaccinating these animals is not out of well-being is not out of concern for individual animals, but it's out of the fear that this disease, which is zoonotic in nature, can also be transmitted to the farm animals as well as humans. So the concern here is more for anthropocentric reasons, but still these interventions benefit the wild animals as well. Now that I've mentioned some of the ways in which we humans help the wild animals, let us look at the current situation of animals in the wild. Famines and extreme weather conditions is very, very common in the wild, and animals usually are not given adequate assistance during these conditions, and they usually die in very painful ways out of hunger and thirst. And as I mentioned, extreme weather conditions are very common. And for example, there are certain wild animals that go into hibernation during the extreme cold, like bears or deer. And there are also some invertebrates like crickets that go into hibernation during the cold conditions. So sometimes during these extreme conditions, they come out of their hibernation. And once they come out of their hibernation, they're not able to go back. And they usually don't have access to food during these conditions. So they die in very painful ways out of hunger, thirst, or being predated upon. And it's not just the larger animals. Invertebrates suffer in much larger numbers. And for example, they are very prone to parasitic infections and fungal infections, where for example, this is an example of chytroidomycosis, where it affects the skin of the frog. And as an amphibian, a frog breathes through its skin, and this fungal infection covers the skin and does not allow the frog to respire, and it affects the metabolism of the frog. And so the frog usually suffocates to death in very painful way. And parasites and fungal infections are very common in the wild, and they affect a huge number of invertebrates. And the disasters are also very common. For example, this is an example of Kaziranga National Park, where there are annual floods, and each year more than 400 animals die. And this was in 2018, where over 400 animals died. And this only considers the larger animals. If we also consider the number of invertebrates affected by these disasters, then the number shoots up much higher. And there's also animals that are injured due to falling off from the nest, and injuries are very common in the wild due to being affected by the conditions, the weather conditions, where they fall off from the nest. Or for example, this bird which tried to fly away from the nest, but it usually falls. Actually, there's a statistic that most birds that try to fly off from the nest, they usually fall off to the ground, and then they are predated upon by other animals, or they die due to starvation. So let us talk about another interesting reason why it is reasonable to assume that the amount of suffering in the wild is much higher than the amount of positive experiences that animals experience in the wild. So a lot of animals reproduce in a way where the number of offsprings that are born are much higher in number, and the amount of parental care that they receive is very low. Let's look at two different examples. For example, a bullfrog, which gives birth to more than 10,000 tadpoles, out of which less than 1% end up surviving. The rest of them end up dying due to starvation or competition for resources or being eaten by predators. And on the contrary, a species like elephant, which gives birth to one or two offsprings and gives them a lot of parental care, and it ensures that these animals survive to their adulthood. But these tadpoles or these species which reproduce in a way where they give birth to a huge number of offsprings, they don't give a lot of parental care. And a lot of these individuals, they end up dying very short after their birth. So it's reasonable to assume that most of the individuals that come into existence in the wild, they live a short and a very painful life. So this form of reproductive strategy is one of the most prevalent forms of reproduction in the wild, where a huge number of offsprings are born and many of them end up dying soon after they are born. And it's not just invertebrates that give birth that way. It's also turtles, for example, that give birth to over 100 offsprings a single time, and then most of them, they end up dying soon after they're born, and very few of them survive to adulthood. So I just tried to give a brief of some of the ways in which animals in the wild suffer in terrible ways. And I've also mentioned that it's reasonable to expect that majority of the individuals that come into existence in the wild live a very short and painful life. So hearing all these scenarios, you might think that it's impossible for humans to go out of their way and help animals in the wild, because usually when humans interfere in the wild, they do it for anthropocentric reasons, to cut down the forests or to harm animals for hunting, etc. But very rarely do they go out of their way to help animals for their own sake. So it is still possible to help animals in the wild. And when we reject speciesism, it also implies that we help animals when they are suffering due to natural reasons as well. So let us look at some of the work that we at Animal Ethics are doing to create more awareness about this issue of wild animal suffering and some of the ways in which we can help them. We have made our information widely available. We have made our information accessible to a lot of animal advocates by publishing this information on our website. We have a lot of detailed information available. And if you're interested in learning more about wild animal suffering and the different ways in which humans exploit animals, I would highly suggest you go to our website and look at our sections on wild animal suffering and exploitation. And another major barrier to create more awareness about this issue of speciesism and wild animal suffering is that huge majority of the population of the world does not speak English, and most of the content that exists about speciesism is usually in English. So we at Animal Ethics have translated our content into more than 8 languages, especially to the ones that are more widely spoken across the world. For example, Mandarin, and as well as Hindi, which is spoken in India. So we've made this information available in these languages so that the advocates from this region are also able to access this information and are able to educate themselves and others. We've also recently published a video course which explores in much more detail the issues of speciesism as well as wild animal suffering. So if you're interested in going through this course, I would highly suggest you check out our YouTube channel, where this course is available and where we explore into much more depth these issues. And if you really want to help animals in the wild, it's very important that we do a lot of scientific studies to understand what is the current situation of animals in the wild, how are they suffering, and what are the different interventions that we can use to help them, and what are the most effective interventions. Because there is a concern among a lot of scientists that if we go into the wild, we'll end up disrupting the harmony or the cycle which exists in a particular ecosystem. So we are currently supporting research into this field called welfare biology, where we try to understand the situation of animals in the wild and how we can help them to understand better ways of helping them without causing more harm. For example, recently we published a study on the situation of wild animals in forest fires and how we can help them, which is being published on our website. So if you're interested, I'd recommend you to go onto our blog section and you'll find the study there. We are also currently working on many such studies. For example, we are working on a blueprint for a brucellosis vaccination program in the Yellowstone National Park for wild bisons, where we are studying a possible strategy where we vaccinate wild bisons against brucellosis to prevent them from suffering. We also do outreach, public outreach, where we distribute leaflets and have conversations with public to educate them about speciesism and wild animal suffering. We also give talks at institutes where we educate the academics as well as the professors about speciesism and why it is important to reject speciesism and how they can include anti-speciesist work in their research. And we've been giving these talks in multiple parts of the world. This was from a talk in India where we were focusing on life sciences, students of life sciences, and trying to encourage them to conduct more research into the field of wild animal welfare and welfare biology. So this was a brief of what animal ethics is doing to combat speciesism and to create more awareness about why rejecting speciesism is important. If you're interested in supporting our work, I would highly recommend you follow us on Facebook or reach out to us. And we would be very, very interested in accepting your contribution, whether it is through donations or through volunteering. We would be very happy to discuss if you are interested in volunteering with us. So thank you so much for attending the talk today. If you have any questions, please write it down in the live chat and I would be happy to answer them. So if there are no questions, I'll be ending this stream, but I'll give it a couple minutes. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them and discuss them with you. All right, since there are no, yeah, we have a question here from Komi. What are your thoughts on Gary Francione if you have read him? Right. So yeah, Gary Francione was one of the very first authors that I read, and his work is very interesting. And he takes a more rights-based approach to speciesism. And I really respect the work that he does. And I find it very inspiring. And he takes this abolitionist stance against animal exploitation, where he believes that animals should not be exploited. And to be honest, we at Animal Ethics are working towards the same goal, where we envision a world where animals are living a better life and they are liberated from the harms that humans are causing them. But a rights-based approach does not cover other aspects of speciesism. Speciesism is philosophically neutral, whether it is rights-based approach or whether it is contractarianism, whether it's utilitarianism. Speciesism is a more general bias, which is unjustified in any of these philosophies or any of these school of ethics. So yeah, I find his work very encouraging and inspiring, but his rights-based approach does not cover the topic of wild animal suffering adequately. That's what I feel. For example, he believes that wild animals have a right not to be helped by humans, that they should live a life completely independent of human interference. But as I've said, animals in the wild are not living an idyllic, happy life. They are suffering in many ways. And if we reject speciesism, it also implies that we need to help animals in the wild whenever we see them suffering. So I am not sure Gary Francione's view on this. And I think the rights-based approach does not cover it adequately, but there is also a need, for example, a need for a right to not undergo unnecessary suffering, which can also be included within this category of anti-speciesism. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but if you have any follow-up questions, I'd be happy to answer them. There's also another question by Pixie FM, which is that, do you have any examples of ways to help wild animals affected by weather events? Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And for example, let's take two instances, one of the forest fires that occurred in Australia, and it was a widely publicized event, and there was widespread concern for some species of animals like koala, which were harmed by the forest fires. And a lot of individuals went out of their way to help these koalas from these areas that were affected with forest fires. And there were also people who were donating to the organizations that were helping wild animals affected by forest fires. So these are some of the two basic ways, I think. If you personally notice any animal affected by a weather event, you can try fostering them or taking them to a rescue center, or you can try donating to the organizations that help animals during these weather events. And there's also another thing which you can do is you can ask your leaders to support policies which includes helping animals during disasters. Asking the politicians, for example, here in India during the floods that occurred in Kaziranga, there was widespread concern to protect rhinos from the floods. So they asked the politicians, the political leaders, to to invest into policies that will help rhinos from floods. So there were cases of animals, there were cases of these artificial highlands being constructed so that during the floods, the rhinos can take shelter on these artificial highlands. And animals were benefited. It's not just rhinos, a variety of animals were helped by these interventions of artificial highlands. So yeah, I think these are some ways, asking your political leaders to consider non-human animals as well during the disaster rescue efforts, and donating to organizations that help animals during disasters, and as well as just creating awareness, creating concern about the suffering of wild animals during weather events, I think would be a good first step that we can take to help them. Yeah. All right. So I see no more questions. Thank you so much for attending the talk today. We'll be conducting a second talk for another time zone tonight at 9:30 p.m. Indian time. You can find the time it will be conducted on your time zone on our website. And we are also conducting talks in Portuguese and Spanish. So if you're interested, I'd recommend you go there as well. There's another question, which is any advice for talking to people who insist their religion permits the exploitation of animals? So therefore, it's okay even if they have an option not to. Right, that's an interesting question. So religion is a very sensitive topic, right? There are different forms of practices which involve harming animals in certain forms of religion. So yeah, it is a sensitive issue. So it involves looking at the religious structure and finding ways of including animals into the circle of compassion. There is this golden rule which states that treat other individuals as you would want to be treated. And a lot of religions across the world follow this golden rule in one way or another, which is treat an individual in the way you would want to be treated. And since you would want to be respected and you would want your interests and rights to be respected, it also implies that just as you would want to be respected, or you would want your dog not to be harmed, which you care about, it would also imply that you care about other animals as well. So there are a lot of these logical inconsistencies when we talk about religion, and it needs to be approached with more care. And uh, yeah, we need to be more careful when we are advocating against a religion, and to find beliefs of compassion within that religion to to advocate for also respecting the interests of animals. So yeah, that I think, for example, in Hinduism, when I go out and I do outreach, so yeah, there are some practices which involve harming animals within Hinduism, but there's also this belief of ahimsa or non-violence, which a lot of people believe in. So I use that value and I also extend that value to non-human animals. And I try to explain it to them that since we believe in non-violence for humans, why not we extend it for non-human animals as well? Because their interests matter equally and they are also harmed by our actions. So why not also extend non-violence to these other sentient beings? So that is the usual approach that I use. And it would be interesting to hear, the other strategies that you have in mind. Yep. Thank you so much for your questions. I hope you enjoyed the talk. And with this, I would call for rejecting speciesism, and I would hope that you spread this message among your friends and family. And thank you so much for attending this talk. Have a good day. Bye.